Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today we will discuss a module from reading new literature in English, and the module is on Dalit and tribal literature in English translation. Translation, in my understanding, is a claim of one's right, one's identity, one's voice, and one's existence. Translation always helps to form a new space in another culture, another world, other than the culture or world from which the original text has been emerged. India has for than a century old Dalit literature and tribal literature which is older than the history of Indian civilization, what is known in history. Translation always opens a new scope, a wider spectrum for the author to fulfill her or his objective of writing. Dalit literature is chronicle of Dalit life as a whole. It is a documentary of Dalit oppression, anger, struggle, the sorrow, claims, etc. Writing is also political act, and it is a part of greater activism. Dalit literature is a part of Dalit movement. Similarly, the tribal literature is also chronicle of tribal life, oppression, history, their culture and their claims. When some Dalit literature and tribal literature is being translated into English, or tribal literature from its orality is written in some other language or any nearby adapted language, then it is already proved the objective of that writing or translating is to fight against the power of oppressor, and writing is part of their movement. Most of the tribal communities in India do not have their own script. So they have to adapt script from other languages for writing their words, to let the world know about themselves and to establish their human rights. So in that sense, that writing itself for tribal literature is a claim for human right. If you see in case of Santhali, that Santhalis are mainly staying in West Bengal, Orissa, Bihar, Jharkhand and some portion of Chhattisgarh. And they have adopted the nearby language, the neighboring language of the Santhal community, and they wrote their literature in that language. Many Santhali literature have been written in Bangla, some have been written in Odia, some in Hindi, like this. But the tribal literature is mainly oral since thousands of years, as they do not have their own script, as we know. Few communities among the Adivasis or tribal have made their own script, like the Santalis made the Olchiki script by Pandit Raghunath Murmu in 1920s. Others write in the script they are comfortable with. In this sense, the term tribal literature is by its nature itself is a translation, because it is translation from non-verbal to verbal. We are translating the katha, the stories, the poems, the music, the script of dance and folk drama, their tribal drama, script of tribal drama, stories, etc. in writing, because all these were in non-verbal form. either in performance or in painting or sculpture. And while it is written, it is actually coming from non-verbal to verbal. And when it is translated, it is widely circulated for different communities and the wider reader groups. Because this work, I mean, from non-verbal to verbal, writing tribal literature from non-verbal to verbal itself is translation. Because in most of the cases, the oral traditions are getting documented, recorded through writing only. And we know when we say literature, it is necessarily written. So when we are talking about tribal literature, it is written. So form has been changed. There are large number of tribal communities in India. Sometimes we find different lingua franca for different tribal groups or nearby tribal groups to communicate with each other, like the Nagamis as a lingua franca among the tribal communities in Nagaland. And like this, we can find the lingua franca among the tribal communities of Manipur, tribal communities of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. In all the areas, they have their own lingua franca for communicating. So when we talk about tribal literature in a single literature department, it has tended to be adopted as a monolithic cultural or literary practice in our psyche. However, this happens because of age-old distance among the tribal and non-tribal groups, non-tribal communities. There is huge gap in literary communication between tribal and non-tribal communities. And now question may arise, if the tribal literature is not understood as monolithic, then why we call it tribal literature? This is categorization of literary creation according to the nature of creative expression or according to the similarity in different degree among the literary creation. So there are lots of groups of tribal communities and they have their own literature with own flavor. Even the Dalit literature in India, they have differences, because Dalit literature in Maharashtra, it comes from different socio-political background, in spite of having the social oppression. Social oppression is common among the Dalit literature from different languages. But in spite of having the same kind of social oppression or social oppression of same nature, there are different kind of political, economic and cultural background from which the Dalit literature in India has been emerged. So the emergence of Bengali literature is different than the emergence of Marathi literature or Tamil literature or Kannada, Malayalam or Telugu literature or in the Hindi Dalit literature. So they have their own differences of socio-political, cultural and economic background. So when we talk about Dalit literature, we should not imagine Dalit literature as also monolithic. It has its own multi-layers within the discourse of Dalit literature. It is multifaceted, and tribal literature is also that. So when we are talking about, in this module, we are talking about Dalit and tribal literature which are translated into English. Tapan Basu, in his introduction to the Katha series of Translating Caste, he commented the translation of caste as a social institution into an assortment of cultural discourses. So when we are translating Dalit literature, there is a social history, a social background within which the Dalit literature has been emerged. But when we are translating Dalit literature, we are not talking about only the social oppression, because it contributes to the critical discourse about caste and caste related any socio-economic and political matters. And as a literary text, that translated Dalit literature appears as a cultural product, and that cultural product contributes its own voice very distinctively in the mainstream culture also, because in mainstream culture we are discussing about the Dalit literature, and same thing happens for the tribal literature, because there is, as I mentioned, that 1,000 years old difference between the Dalit tribal and non-tribal groups, and because of that the non-tribal groups are so ignorant about the tribal groups, and non-tribal groups believe that tribals are uncivilized, or they are not modern, they are primitive, and all these things, all these issues, but they have their own sense of modernity. And when we are translating tribal literature in English, then it is getting a wide circulation and wide reading, and it itself, this translation becomes a product of cultural discourse, an element of cultural discourse. So quite a same thing is happening in case of tribal literature and Dalit literature, though the socio-political and economic backgrounds are so different between Dalit literature and tribal literature. But while we are talking about the translation, English translation of Dalit literature and tribal literature, we are actually talking about the cultural discourses and their contribution to that cultural discourses. Moreover, Tapan Basu commented that treatment of caste theme in all India literary arena. So while it is translated, we are observing that translated Dalit literature and tribal literature as a treatment towards the caste problem or the racial problem or the marginal problem of marginal issues from a pan-Indian or Indian literary arena. And when tribal literature or Dalit literatures are translated into English, they are contributing to the cluster of Indian literature which is actually imagined through English. And from that point of view, we find a most original contribution of literature in the sphere of Indian literature. Now let us talk about new literature in English and the context of Dalit and tribal literature. Augsburg University, in their website of English and American Study, they say that the term New English Literatures, or NEL in abbreviation, refers to the Anglophone literatures of Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, Oceania, and Canada. The field has direct overlaps with English studies, for instance, by including Black and Asian British literatures, as well as travel writing. Via Canadian literatures, it is also closely linked to the field of North American studies, a special focus in the Augsburg's New English literature. So, New English literature is also a concept which includes a diversity of English literature from different parts of the world. New English, the concept of New English literature might be same in everywhere in the world, in different in the academics of different universities of different parts of the world, but the thing is that the practice of New English literature is quite different. It depends on the cultural and political problem or necessities of some particular area. When it is about Augsburg University, they are focusing on the Canadian literature or the American literature in the arena of New English literature. Now let us talk about the another university. In both research and teaching, we foreground transnational and transcultural exchange processes and develops historical and contemporary rather than specific national literature. Accordingly, issues of cultural plurality and hybridity, as well as literary negotiations of colonization, and decolonization, migration, diaspora, and social inequality are central lines of inquiry and research. Literary studies are therefore practiced as transcultural and comparative analysis of text from a broad variety of national and cultural context. Literature with its specific aesthetic forms is understood as part of larger cultural and societal constellations and connections to other forms of cultural productions. Film, photography, painting are frequently included in our teaching and research. The earlier quotation is from the Augsburg University, and now we are going to talk about the Warwick University and their focus on new literature in their Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies. Through the medium of English, writers from Africa and Asia today confront a prospectively global audience. This module aims to introduce students to the emergent body of literature being produced by writers and filmmakers from South Asia, and to situate it in terms of the historical circumstances that have engendered it and to which it constitutes a response, I unquote. So from the understanding of these two universities, Augsburg and Warwick, these two universities just have been taken for to put as example of practicing new literature in English. So from these two university websites, we can understand that new literature is adapted to study in the English literature department or English and comparative literature department, and the methodology of studying new literature is comparative, and they are trying to focus on the marginal literature, the tribal literature, the women literature, and the new concurrents what are happening in the literary understanding with the growing complexities of world politics, culture, religion, and etc. And for Warwick University, they are mainly focusing on the South Asian literature and South Asian films to understand the South Asian context. And through this new English literature, actually we can observe the emergence of new category of literature which is identified as emergent literature. Those literary texts or writers or literary areas what were not much discussed or were not much represented in world academics. Now those areas or languages or writers are now being represented, like the South Asian writers and South Asian literatures are represented in world academics, and now they are being accommodated in the idea, in the Western idea of world literature. I mention it Western idea of world literature because every area of world has their own idea or own practice or own geographic location of world literature. So the South Asian literature, the Southeast Asian literature or Eastern Asian literature are getting their space in the Western academics, and these writers are getting the interest of the global readership. Global readership in the sense that those literary texts are being circulated in Europe, in America, in Canada, Australia, and different parts of South Asia. Earlier, the literary flow only was from the Europe and America to the South, and now the South Asia or South is becoming the global South, because that literary flow are going towards the Europe and US also. So this new English literature is actually kind of making balance sheet. It's actually balancing the literary production and record of thoughts from different worlds. Europe, US, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Eastern Asia, Australia, and different any other parts of the world like the Middle East, West Asia, all these areas. The literature of all these areas now talked in the academics. And when we are talking about new English literature, we have to keep it in mind that this new English literature is an academic category. Because literature, beyond academics, literature has its own life. But when we are talking about new English literature, we are talking about an academic category of literature. Now, let us talk about post-colonial and or new literature. It is another debate whether we call new literature in English as post-colonial literature. But more specifically, what is important here, whether this Dalit and tribal literature is post-colonial literature. Post-colonialism as a school of thought and a pattern of thinking is much debated. Many scholars worldwide claim for the end of post-colonialism. Many scholars emphasize on the limitation of the thought as it by nature cannot be objective critique of colonialism. The text what are referred in the post-colonial in post-colonial studies were written mostly during colonial rule as the protest against colonial power. Post-colonialism offers new interpretation and historicizes those texts, and that is why we need of post-colonialism. All the tribal literature was not under the direct influence of colonialism in India especially. When we call it direct influence, we would like to mean that the modern Indian literature is the creation of direct influence of Europe, because those literary genres, literary forms, authors, literary patterns, everything were patronized by the British or European institution, or the writers of modern India or 19th century India. They were educated from the colonial institutions. So they adapted the colonial style of writing, they adapted colonial genres, themes, forms, etc. And we can observe the anti-colonial movement in case of culture and literature also was being started during the colonial period. So we can find the use of the pre-colonial ideas, thoughts, themes, and the styles, methodologies we can find in use of even 19th century modern Indian writing. When we are talking that tribal literature was not under direct influence of Europe or under colonialism, we mean that the tribal authors or tribal literature were not patronized by the British institution or European institution. Even there is no formal author of tribal writer, tribal literature, because it is a production of a community. They are sharing the community stories, they are dancing the traditional dance or traditional theater, they are talking about their community. So there is no one author. Many authors are contributing. Even when a tribal song is written by one person, that one person is also carrying the tradition and thoughts from his or her community. And that writing, that indigenous style, that theme, that methodology, nothing was influenced by the colonial writing style, colonial methodology, colonial idea of literature, colonial idea of aesthetics, or the colonial form of writing literature. So in that sense, tribal literature was not under direct influence of colonialism or colonial practices. The colonial institutions did not influence their culture much. So tribal culture is indigenous culture till now, but the modern, the mainstream culture, mainstream modern Indian culture is hybrid culture. So something indigenous, something truly new, original, actually emerges from the practice of tribal literature, even from the practice of Dalit literature, though they have adapted the genre, the Western genre of novel, of short story, of play, of writing autobiography, writing European style for writing history, but the theme and the life and the society where that Dalitism is coming, it is indigenous. It is not much influenced or much changed because of the colonial practices. So the theme and the cultural elements what are there in Dalit writings are very much originally Indian, because those are indigenous. And Balchandra Nemade once commented that in true sense, nativism in India is folded by the Dalit and the tribal communities in India. So, when we are talking about Dalit literature and tribal literature in English translation, we are not only talking about the new literature in English, but those are truly original writing from India. India's contribution in this category of new literature in English, which is very much original. Moreover, tribal and Dalit literature in their history talks about colonial era and colonial policies, but their main agenda are focusing on the issues related with the Indian state and complexities in Indian politics, society and culture, what have been observed since independence. Because the problems of Dalits and tribal are not the problems which have been originated during colonial rule, but it has its roots in the prehistoric period. The tribal are facing problem because of the tribal and non-tribal conflicts which have been happening since long time, since the long time past of pre-colonial era, and during colonial era also they had to suffer the same. Even in independent era, the colonial rules are not abolished but modified. So now what tribals are creating, tribals are talking about, it is also about the complexities what they have been facing because of the anti-tribal policies of Indian politics and the mainstream cultural domination, etc. So what in contemporary tribal literature we are getting, it is actually it is actually about their fight against the Indian state, fight against the Indian civil society, Indian mainstream culture, Indian mainstream politics, etc. And so in that sense, the Dalit literature and tribal literature, they are not post-colonial in that sense, but the very emergence of Dalit literature and tribal literature and the discussion of Dalit literature and tribal literature in mainstream culture might be coming from the post-colonial attitude and post-colonial understanding to represent the marginal, to talk about the marginal, to write about the alternative history or talk about alternative modernity. Because Balchandra Nemade also in his nativism talks that this indigenous cultural essence can be found in Indian tribal and Dalit communities. So when we are talking, and many Marxist theories or post-colonial theories or the theorists who deal with colonialism and post-colonialism, they opine that in true sense the anti-colonial movement or anti-colonial epistemology can be formed with folk culture, indigenous culture, tribal culture, Dalit culture, and from the small unorganized movement what happened in history, the indigenous movements like the movements of Birsa Munda, Sidho Kano, or the movement for freedom organized by Titumir in North 24 Parganas district of West Bengal. Those are not directed by any particular ideology, any particular political ideology. Those are not much organized. So from that history, from that literary practices, from that cultural practices, we can find the true alternative of colonial epistemology, colonial history, colonial literature. And we can find the true alternative of themes and narratives of our literature, which is very much influenced by colonialism. The critique of colonialism is actually the indigenous folk tribal culture of colonized subject, because such cultures are not influenced, or those cultures are uninterrupted. So the thing is that we can provide an alternative of colonial rule and colonial culture through this culture of writing Dalit and tribal literature, and circulation and publication and translation of those in English. So in that sense, these are not post-colonial literature in true sense, but these can provide an alternative for anti-colonial practice of epistemology of any kind, of any area. So the voices which are heard from the Dalits and tribals are actually emerging voices in literature to re-establish their claims, rights, and raise the question of socio-cultural and political equality. In that sense, this category may be understood as emergent literature in English also. Now the translation and curriculum. Dilip Chavan, professor of English of SRTM University, Nanded, also observed that English translation of Dalit literature as a contribution to curriculum. Knowledge is not objective and neutral. So when we are translating this, we are accommodating, we are adapting, we are actually contributing to the academic, new academic curricula. We are putting those literature in academic curricula, and new claims, new voices are being emerged from the academic practices of those literature. I quote from him, translating caste is first and foremost intended to fulfill a pedagogical function. It proposes to bring the issues of caste and its textual representation in contemporary Indian literature into the classroom of universities in India and abroad. The text will be made available to the students for their classroom through English translation of those texts. Now talk about writing or translating Dalit aesthetics or tribal aesthetics. We are talking about Dalit aesthetics, and the textbook of Dalit, the book on Dalit aesthetic theory is being written by Saran Kumar Limbale in Marathi, Dalit Sahitya che Saundarya Shastra, and it is translated into English by renowned scholar Arun Mukherjee as Towards Aesthetics of Dalit Literature. So when we are translating Dalit aesthetics, we are translating tribal aesthetics, actually we are trying to understand what is tribal literature, what is Dalit literature, what is the what should be the new methodology to criticize, to understand, to analyze Dalit literature or tribal literature. So translating the aesthetics is also an important thing, because this provide a separate tool to understand those literary categories, because it is not believed that established tools or aesthetics or literary theories or methodologies of analysis of literature, analysis of mainstream literature can be appropriate to analyze Dalit and tribal literature. Dalit and tribal literature by its nature is multilingual, because Dalit literature is being created from Maharashtra, from Tamil Nadu, from Kerala, from Karnataka, from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, from Uttar Pradesh, from West Bengal, from different regions. So when we are talking about Dalit literature, these are not produced in any single language. These are produced in many languages. And when these are translated into English, these are actually translated into a caste-less language, because all other modern Indian languages have their own caste system. And the language system, we can find the existence of casteist words or words of caste significance in the language system. So when these are translated into English, these texts are translated into a language what does not have caste. But our point is that Dalit literature and tribal literature by its nature is multilingual. So multifaceted undercurrents are there in this category. So this is a caution that we should not understood Dalit literature and tribal literature as monolithic structure, as monolithic literature. Now let us talk about publication of Dalit and tribal literature in English. Oxford University Press, Orient Black Swan, Navayana, Katha, Speaking Tiger, all these are leading houses publishing Dalit and tribal literature into English. We can find that Poison Bread translation from modern Marathi Dalit literature, which was published in 1992, and it was edited by Arjun Dangle. Anthology of Dalit Literature of Poems, which was published by Eleanor Jelliot in 1992. Towards and Aesthetics of Dalit Literature, published in 2004 by Orient Black Swan. The Oxford India Anthology of Telugu Dalit Literature, Oxford India Anthology of Malayalam Dalit Literature, or the Oxford India Anthology of Dalit literature from Eastern India, which is going to be published, and Oxford Indian Anthology of Telugu Dalit Literature, and the publication of C.K. Janu's Mother Forest, Bama's Karukku, in numerous number of tribal and Dalit literature have been published or translated into English. And this literature original contribution from contemporary India, which talks about the 1,000 years old system or civilization or culture or language or beliefs. Now we are getting all those, and those are widely circulated worldwide. Those are circulated. And we can talk about the Bhasha Research Foundation, Bhasha Research Organization of G.N. Devi, from where the scholastic works on tribals have been happened, and tribal theatre group have been emerged, and Ganesh Devi, under his leadership, so many scholastic works on tribal literature have been happened. And this is how the knowledge, the epistemology about the tribal literature and Dalit literature has been formed. The initiative has been taken on behalf of few stalwart figures and the translators and the literary practitioners. So the publication of Dalit and tribal literature is also is important, very important, to contribute in the discourse of that new English literature, this category. Tribal literature in English. It is not always true that tribal literature or Dalit literatures are always written in other language and then these are translated into English, but we can find that directly written tribal literature in English, that Shobhendra Shekhar Hasda from Jharkhand, who writes tribal literature in English, and he is quite famous now, and he very clearly he is able to establish his voice and voice of the community, not only the Santali community where he belongs, but he is talking on behalf of the tribal or oppressed class people of India. And he owned the Sahitya Akademi Yuba Award, and he wrote the famous book of Mysterious Ailment of Urupi Baski and Adivasi Will Not Dance, which is direct response to the anti-tribal political policy of Indian government or Indian politics. In a personal conversation with Shobhendra Shekhar Hasda, he says that he is writing in English. This is about establishing his claim on the language and on the literature and the whole discourse of politics, culture and literature. I quote from his conversation, yes, a claim on language, yes. Also, my stories are thought in Santali. I think my stories in Santali or Hindi, merely a whore was thought in Hindi. Then write those in English. You can call my stories Santali stories written in English. Yes, English gives me freedom. Also, English works as a great equalizer. It really is our link language. Had I written in Santali or in any other Indian language, my stories would have been limited to readers in that particular language. But because I write in English, which so many people can write, read and speak now, my stories are being read across languages and communities and regions, unquote. And because of this, he is writing in English, he can establish his own claim and he doesn't have any need of translator to be depended on, because he is writing directly in English and he is sending his dissent, his voices to the world. So this is the important, and he is directly contributing in formation of new English literature from India, and he is directly contributing in Indian writing in English, which is not mainstream, but his claim is very significant that he is a Santhali story writer, but he has adapted the language English. So now let us conclude our discussion. From this discussion, we have understood what is new literature in English, what is the area or focus area of new literature is in English, and what is the contribution of Dalit and tribal literature in this discourse of new literature in English. For more details, you please consult the e-text, and for all the references, you consult the e-text. Thank you.